Hi, I'm Mark Johnson with When Light Falls Photography, and thanks for joining me today for this Photoshop video tutorial on how to create an image featuring levitating or floating objects. As you can see in our image, we have a levitating banana and knife. And over here on the right hand side, we've already completed all the layers necessary to construct the image. But don't worry, we'll be stepping through them one by one to show you how it's done. Okay, let's begin. The first thing I'm going to do is turn off all these layers and leave just the background layer on. When doing these types of shots, it's important that you take two images. One of the background without any subject in it, and one of the subject in its setup format. So you can see here we have the banana in its sliced configuration held together with these toothpicks, and the knife appearing to cut through the last section of the banana, supported by this polystyrene block. Okay, so the object here is to remove these toothpicks and remove that polystyrene block and make it appear as if the knife and the banana are both levitating. To do this, we start by putting a mask over the setup layer. Everything we're doing is non-destructive, so I don't have to worry about duplicating the layers, although that never hurts, always a good idea. However, I'm just going to go right ahead and apply this mask. Once I have the mask applied, I'm going to paint over the section of the styrene block here so that we can expose the background layer underneath. To do that, I'm going to select the brush tool, make sure it's black, and the opacity is up at 100%. Now, I don't know if you noticed on the background layer, but we had different exposure, we actually had different focus, and with different colour tones on the background layer. So this is going to look a little peculiar, I suspect, when we start to paint it out. Yep, you can see we've got quite clear differences in the background layer and the foreground layer. Background layer is brighter, it's in focus here, whereas we've already got it out of focus on the foreground layer. So a handy hint when you're doing these types of images is to set your camera on a tripod and set the exposure and the focus to manual and lock it in. Okay, nonetheless, we will still continue to tackle this and do some blending as we move forward. So the first thing we have to try and do is make this background layer look a lot more like the foreground layer. To do that, we're going to use adjustment layers. So we have to make sure the adjustment layers are applied beneath the setup layer so that they only affect the background layer. So I select the background layer and I click on an adjustment layer, and the first one we're going to do is brightness and contrast, and that will place the adjustment layer just above the background layer. I'm going to go up here and reduce the brightness a touch and just reduce the contrast a touch also. You can see that we've already darkened that down and it's beginning to look better, but now we'll go in and we'll apply a second adjustment layer, this time for hue and saturation. And what we want to try and do is add a little more magenta to this background layer here. So we're going to reduce that down a touch, add in some magenta, increase the saturation, reduce the lightness a little bit. So it's already looking better. Now you can go into each of the different channels here and make individual adjustments just to get it exactly right. Okay, so you can see that we've got it close, but it's still looking a bit odd because this patch is kind of showing out different to the rest of it. So we're going to go back up to our setup layer here, click on the mask, and reduce the opacity of our brush down to about 60%. Increase the brush size just a little bit, and we'll create a gradiated adjustment here. And then we'll go and reduce it further down to about 20% and blend in that change a little more so it's not so visually obvious. Okay, so you get the idea of what we're going for there. So now I'll delete these three layers and I'll turn on the ones I've done earlier so you can see the finished article. So that's the adjustment layer with the magenta into it, also with the brightness and contrast showing, and here's the setup layer with the masking on. That doesn't look too bad. Okay, so next we have to go and tend to these toothpicks. We're going to use the clone tool to clone out these toothpicks. Now when I do this, I do the cloning in different sections on different layers. So I'm going to create a new layer and clone out this toothpick at the bottom. And then I'll create another new layer, clone out these two, and a third one to clone out the one by the knife. So let's go ahead and have a look at how we do the one at the bottom first of all. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer that we'll clone onto. And we're going to zoom in so we can see what we're doing. Always a good idea to work at 100% or more when cloning. I'm going to select my clone tool, I've got the mode set to dark in here and the opacity to 70%. It's good to play around with darken and lightening and normal when you're cloning, and you'll find that the darken will only cover areas that are lighter than it, and the light will only cover areas that darken. It helps restrict the cloning a little bit and gives a bit more realistic approach. So here we go here. I've got my new layer selected. I'm going to hold down my Alt key and select the place I want to clone from and just begin to clone over. That chopstick, that matchstick. Now you can see I'm selecting different areas to clone from so that we don't get a repetitive pattern building up. And I'm just going to zoom in a little bit further. I need to change this back to normal now. There we go. And you can see we successfully removed that toothpick. And you go ahead and you do the same thing for all the rest of them. So what I'll do is I'll delete this layer and I'll show you the completed cloning layers. As you can see, I have the 3 cloning layers, one for the lower stick down here, the second and third layers, and one for the top where the knife is. And now we've got a pretty nice image of the knife and the banana and its various segments levitating. But it's still not quite realistic enough. We have to go back and we have to look at where the light's coming from and put some finishing touches in, like shadows and the like. So first thing I want to do is I want to draw a shadow in along the bottom of the knife handle here, just to mimic where we have the shadow at the end either side and there's been some light fall off. Now to do that, I will go in and create another new layer. Just above the cloning layer. And for this part of it, I want to create a nice brown shadow. So I'm going to go and pick my color picker tool here. I'll click on the layer, not the mask, but the actual layer that we use for the setup, and I'll select some color from the handle here. It should be a nice brown color. You can see we've got a nice brown color selected here. And then I'll go back to my layer and I'll choose the paintbrush, reduce the size of it, a nice low opacity. I've got about 20% there. And then what I'll do is I'll just build up that shadow. So you can see I'm just painting on the shadow there. And then if I want it a bit darker, I can go over it again until I get what I'm looking for along there. And you can adjust the channel blend modes for darken, dark color, colored burn is pretty nice. Overlay works. I'm thinking soft light is the best for what we're looking for here. And you get the idea of being able to paint in the shadow. Okay, next we have to add in a shadow on the floor underneath the knife and shadows on the floor underneath the banana sections. Now, to do this, I'm going to create another new layer, one for the underneath the knife and one for underneath the banana sections. We'll go ahead and do the one underneath the knife handle first. So here's my new layer for that. Then what I'm going to go and do is make a selection here that approximates the shape of the handle. Just real quick, like so. I'm going to go to my bucket tool. I'm going to fill it with black. And then I'm going to deselect it. So now I've got this black splodge on a new layer. And what I want to do here is go up and apply Gaussian blur to it. Quite a heavy Gaussian blur. So I go filter blur, Gaussian blur. And I've selected about 50 pixels, 55 pixels, quite a heavy blur. And I say OK. And that gives us a nice blurred edge to that shadow. But then I change the blending mode to soft light. And I move the shadow down into place. And that's a bit better. That's more with what we're looking for. Okay, if I am worried about the shadow being too bright, I can just change the opacity of it and dull it down a little bit. And if I want to come back and just make a slight adjustment to the placement of the shadow, I can. Then you do the same thing for each of the banana sections. Okay, I'm just going to delete these two layers and go back to the ones I created earlier. So here's the shadows group that I made. So you can see I've got some shadow under here, I've got the shadow on the ground there, and I've got the shadow along the knife here. And if I want to go in and make any adjustments to those, I can. So here's the one on the floor, I'm just going to move it back slightly. There you go. And finally, what I need to do now is apply a little motion blur to the handle of the knife. I want it to appear as if it's cutting through the banana. So in order to do that, I create a new layer above everything that I've been doing so far. And I'm going to go up to the layer command and hold down my Alt key and choose merge visible. And what that's going to do is it's going to give me a new layer with all those visible layers merged together into one. From there, I can then go back to my filter command and go to blur. And this time, I'm going to choose motion blur. Now, I've got quite a heavy motion blur, and you can notice the angle is coming back, and quite a fair distance on it with 46. The angle's coming in a kind of downwards chopping angle, kind of following the light, following the shadow direction, if you like, just to apply a little bit of motion blur to that. So I apply that, and of course it applies itself to the whole image, which is not what we want. We just want it on the knife only. So I'm going to hold down the Alt key and go down and create a mask, and that's going to hide the effect behind this black mask. And then what we can then do is go up to the brush, change it to a white brush, and paint that in with a nice big soft brush, selectively to our choosing. So I'm going to go a bit heavier on the handle and softer on the blade. So just a little bit on the blade like this on the edge of this banana, and then go back and we'll do a bit more on the knife handle and a bit more again on the knife handle. And then you can see we're getting some nice motion blur applied to only the knife, and the background's sitting steady. There you go. I will just delete that layer and show you the finished one, and that creates our finished image. Okay, here's the before shot with the setup, and here's the after shot. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I'm Mark Johnson for When Light Falls Photography. Thanks for viewing.